Hey everybody, this is Jordan back again for another segment of In a Snap. I'm Jordan from PictureMonk.com, as you probably already know that because you probably listen to my podcast. But for this episode of In a Snap, I basically want to talk about the other two legs of the exposure triangle, and those are the shutter speed and the ISO. I was originally going to split these up into two different podcasts or two different segments, but I just figured they would be easier and probably easier to understand for beginner photographers if you just hear everything all at once. So aperture, we discussed that in the last podcast, so if you haven't listened to that, you can go head on over there and check that one out. But for this one, like I said, is going to be ISO and shutter speed. So let's start off with ISO. ISO is pretty easy to understand. A lot of the other two legs of photography, the aperture and the shutter speed, basically have two purposes. To let in light, both of them are responsible for letting in light, and aperture is responsible for the amount of focus, and shutter speed is responsible for motion. So for shutter speed, basically in your camera there's what's called a curtain, and in the curtain it goes up and down and opens to where the sensor is exposed, and it does that in an increment of seconds. So it's like you can have a 60th of a second in shutter speed, you can have a second in shutter speed. You can always, some cameras can go up to a 4,000ths of a second of shutter speed, and some can I think one of the Nikons can even, or a couple of the Nikons probably, can actually even go up to 1/8,000th of a second. Now for that you would need a whole lot of light to actually get an exposure, but you can see how fast that curtain can move and expose the sensor behind the curtain. So shutter speed, basically it just lets in light. That's kind of what it is. And so if you want to freeze motion, you need a faster shutter speed to prevent blurring. So let's say you have a runner and you're trying to take a picture of a runner and freeze them in a running pose, you need to have a pretty high shutter speed. It kind of depends on how far you are away from them, and that sort of thing, and how the distance of motion between you and the runner. But I like to try to get it as high as possible. And sometimes if I feel more comfortable if I get it around 1,000ths of a second, and so that will be responsible for raising my ISO to get more light in, opening my aperture to get more light in, that sort of thing. So that's one thing that it's responsible for, is capturing motion like that. And now the other side of that is, if you want to slow it down and capture a blurring effect, you need to have a lower shutter speed, so like a second, 2 second, 3 second, 10 second, 30 second, that sort of thing. But remember, the longer you keep it open, the more light you're going to let in. So it's possible that you could overexpose your image because you're letting in so much light. So that's the basic gist of a shutter speed. Now the ISO, it's extremely simple. The ISO basically is the sensitivity of your sensor in your camera. So if you have it at ISO 100, if that's your lowest that you can go, that means that it's the least sensitive as it can get. So that means that when you take a photo, it's going to do, just the amount of basic sensitivity, and if you don't have shutter speed or an aperture opening to compensate for that, you're probably just going to get a black image because it's not as sensitive enough to gather all the light it needs to actually fully expose the photo. So you would have to raise your ISO. So you would have to, raise it up to 200 or 1600 or 800, something. Have to raise it up higher than that. Some cameras only max out at 6400 ISO. Some can even go up to 12,800. My Canon 6D can actually go up to 25,600, something like that. But again, the problem with that is it introduces more noise to your photo. Now this is all basic information, but it introduces a lot more noise and grain to your photo, and that's not necessarily appealing. So what you kind of want to do is try to use the lowest ISO possible to just accomplish the image that you're trying to take. So if you want to try this out, what you could do is actually take your camera and go to aperture priority mode, and you can set your aperture to, let's say, f8, somewhere around there, and then you can set your ISO to auto. And when you take a photo, you can check the metadata and see what, pointed at different subjects, so pointed outside or indoors or something like that, and see what kind of ISO it gives you and what kind of shutter speed it gives you as well. And you can see what it tries to do to compensate, because when you put it in aperture priority mode, it's only going to take that photo in f8. So or whatever aperture you set, but we set it to f8, so it's only going to go to f8. So that's a cool little test that you can try. So that's the basic parts of combined with last episode of the exposure triangle. And in the next episode, I'm actually going to talk about bringing those all together to actually get a perfect, the perfect image you're trying to capture. So thanks again guys for joining me for the In a Snap segment of the PictureMonk podcast. Hope you guys are enjoying this, and remember to spread it to your friends. Tell them that there's a new guy on the block that has a photography podcast, and I'd very much appreciate it. Again, head on over to PictureMonk.com for a bunch more tutorials and get information about videos and the other podcasts and stuff like that. So again, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next episode of In a Snap.